To be born into Gilded Age money was to inherit a script written by someone who loved the family name more than the child carrying it. But in the parlors of Fifth Avenue and the drawing rooms of Newport, the real authors were often the mothers, women with velvet manners and iron rules. They kept ledgers of invitations, not feelings. They decided who married whom, who was allowed to be seen, and who would be erased for disobedience. In this documentary, 3 dynasties reveal the same cruel math. Affection was optional, but obedience was not. She raised children like investments. The first lesson was not piano or prayer. It was a rule that could ruin you with a single dinner invitation. In the world of American aristocracy, mothers did not simply raise children, they engineered them. By 1880, the social battlefield of New York and Newport had developed a tactical precision that would make military strategists jealous. Every introduction was calculated. Every dance card was vetted. Every letter that entered or left the house passed through maternal hands first. The toolkit was elegant and absolute. Chaperones shadowed daughters at every public appearance, not for safety, but for surveillance. Correspondence was intercepted and read before breakfast. Allowances were adjusted weekly based on behavior, creating a financial leash that could be tightened at the first sign of rebellion. And if a child dared to pursue an unsuitable attachment, the mother had a final weapon: public humiliation disguised as concern. Consider the mechanics. A young woman could not accept an invitation without her mother's approval. She could not leave the house unaccompanied. She could not speak privately with a young man, even at a ball in her own home. Her clothing, her posture, her conversation topics were all managed like a portfolio. One misstep, one unseemly friendship, one whispered rumor, and the consequences were immediate. Invitations dried up. Eligible suitors looked elsewhere. The family's position on the social ladder, so carefully constructed, could slip several rungs in a single season. The mothers themselves had learned this system as daughters. They knew its cruelties intimately, yet they enforced it with even greater vigor, believing that their own suffering had been the price of admission to a world worth any cost. They told themselves they were protecting their children, preparing them, loving them in the only way that mattered, which was to say, loving the family name more than the person carrying it. Money made the machinery possible, but it was social terror that made it effective. A daughter might inherit $1 million, but she could not access it without marriage. A son might bear his father's name, but his mother controlled which doors would open and which would remain locked. The question was never whether you had wealth. The question was whether you would be allowed to use it. This was not neglect. Neglect would have been kinder. This was obsessive, suffocating attention to detail, every detail except the one that mattered. No one asked if the child was happy. No one asked if the child felt loved. Those questions were sentimental, and sentiment was a luxury reserved for people without dynasties to protect. By the time a child reached marriageable age, they had been trained like racehorses. They knew how to enter a room, how to hold a teacup, how to laugh without showing too much enthusiasm. They knew which families were acceptable and which were poison. They knew that their opinions were decorative, their desires irrelevant, and their futures already decided by people who measured love in silence and compliance. The system worked because everyone pretended it was natural. Mothers called it guidance. Daughters called it duty. Society called it civilization. But beneath the etiquette and the elegance, it was a simple transaction. Surrender your personhood, and you can keep your place at the table. What happens when a child wants to be a person, not a symbol? What happens when love feels like captivity and duty feels like death? The answer depends on which mother you were born to, and how far she was willing to go to win. The mother who managed a myth. Before the public ever saw the necklace, the mother had already priced her daughter's future and picked the buyer. Alva Vanderbilt understood something her peers only whispered about. In the new American aristocracy, reputation was not inherited, it was manufactured. She had married into Vanderbilt money in 1875, when the family name still smelled of trains and coal, when old New York society still looked down their noses at the railroad fortune as vulgar and new. Alva decided that if she could not be born into aristocracy, she would buy it, brick by brick, headline by headline, and eventually, daughter by daughter. Her weapon was spectacle. In 1883, she threw a costume ball so lavish that even the Queen of New York society, a Caroline Astor, had to beg for an invitation. The ball cost roughly $250,000, equivalent to about $7 million today. The house itself, a French chateau dropped onto Fifth Avenue, had cost $3 million to build. It had a medieval great hall, a stained glass ceiling, and enough marble to build a small cathedral. Alva did not just want to join society. She wanted to rewrite the rules. By the time her daughter Consuelo turned 16 in 1894, Alva had already mapped the girl's future. The goal was simple: marry Consuelo to European nobility and complete the transformation from railroad money to royal adjacency. The daughter was beautiful, accomplished, and obedient. She spoke French fluently. She could navigate a 14-course dinner without error. She was, in every sense, a perfect product. There was only one problem. Consuelo was in love with someone else. Winthrop Rutherford was handsome, American, and entirely acceptable by any reasonable standard. He came from old New York money. He moved in the right circles, but he was not titled, and to Alva, that made him worthless. When she discovered the romance, she moved with surgical precision. She intercepted their letters. She forbade Consuelo from seeing him. She threatened to cut off the young man's access to society if he did not withdraw. When Winthrop persisted, Alva escalated. She told Consuelo that the stress of her disobedience was literally killing her, that her heart condition would not survive the scandal. She wept. She clutched her chest. She took to her bed and summoned doctors who confirmed, with the careful ambiguity that wealthy clients require, that Mrs. Vanderbilt was indeed suffering. It was theater, but it was theater with consequences. Consuelo, 18 years old and terrified of becoming her mother's murderer, broke off the relationship. Alva already had a replacement ready. Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, was 23 years old, titled, and drowning in debt. His ancestral home, Blenheim Palace, required a fortune to maintain. He needed an American heiress. Alva needed a duke. The match was perfect, provided no one asked the bride what she wanted. The negotiation took months. Alva and the duke's family exchanged letters about settlements and properties, as if arranging a corporate merger. Consuelo was informed of her engagement, not asked. The wedding date was set for November 6th, 1895. The press called it a fairy tale. The contracts called it a transaction. Consuelo called it nothing because no one was listening. In the months before the wedding, Consuelo tried to escape. She begged her mother to cancel the engagement. Alva responded by locking her in her bedroom, not metaphorically, literally. The door was locked from the outside. Meals were brought on trays. Visitors were forbidden. The house staff were instructed to report any attempt at communication. Consuelo sat in her gilded cage and watched the calendar approach November 6th with the numb certainty of someone watching an execution date. The settlement was staggering. Alva agreed to provide $2.5 million in capital stock, generating an annual income of $100,000 for the Duke. In exchange, Consuelo would become a duchess, and Alva would become the mother of royalty. The contracts were signed. The photographers were hired. The cathedral was booked. Can a marriage sold for status ever feel like anything but captivity? Consuelo already knew the answer, but she walked down the aisle anyway, because the only thing more terrifying than marrying the Duke was defying her mother and discovering what punishments remained. A palace built from public applause. The house was enormous, the rules were microscopic, and the mother measured love in silence and compliance. To understand how control becomes infrastructure, you must first understand the scale. The Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue was not a home. It was a statement in limestone and gilt, designed to announce that the family had transcended its origins and entered the realm of myth. But the true theater of power was not Manhattan. It was Newport, Rhode Island, where America's wealthiest families gathered each summer to compete, conspire, and consolidate their grip on the social order. Newport was not a vacation. It was a battlefield disguised as a resort town. The season ran from July through September, and during those months, the social calendar was as rigid as a train schedule. Monday was reception day. Thursday was the casino afternoon. Friday belonged to the opera. Saturdays were reserved for balls, each one a carefully choreographed display of wealth, taste, and access. To miss an event was to signal weakness. To be excluded was to be erased. The cottages themselves were monuments to excess. Marble House, completed in 1892, cost $11 million to build, roughly $350 million in today's money. It required 500 workers and imported materials from around the world: African marble, French bronze, and enough gold leaf to cover every visible surface. The house had 50 rooms. The ballroom could hold 300 guests. The smallest closet was larger than a working-class family's apartment. Inside these palaces, the rules multiplied like viruses. Daughters were expected to change clothing 5 to 7 times per day, each outfit appropriate to the hour and occasion. Morning dress for breakfast, walking dress for the promenade, tea gown for afternoon visitors, dinner dress for the evening meal, ball gown for the night's entertainment. The wardrobe for a single season could cost $50,000, and the dresses could not be repeated. To wear the same gown twice was to confess that you could not afford new ones. The staff required to maintain this illusion numbered in the dozens. A typical Newport cottage employed 30 to 40 people: butlers, footmen, ladies' maids, cooks, scullery maids, gardeners, coachmen, and a small army of housemaids who worked invisible hours to ensure that no dust, no wrinkle, no imperfection ever disturbed the fantasy. The servants had their own hierarchy, their own rules, their own resentments. But they were united in one task: making the family look effortless. For the daughters, this was prison with a chandelier. Every moment was scheduled. Every interaction was supervised. The chaperones were relentless, like shadowing their charges from breakfast until midnight, ensuring that no improper word was spoken, no unsuitable attachment was formed. A young woman could not accept a flower without her mother's approval. She could not walk to the end of the lawn unaccompanied. She could not express an opinion that contradicted the family line. Alva Vanderbilt was a master of this machinery. She hosted dinners for 60 guests, where the table settings alone cost more than most families earned in a year. She organized charity events that raised thousands of dollars while secretly using them as auditions for social position. She kept ledgers of who owed whom favors, who had slighted whom, and who was rising or falling in the invisible rankings that governed their world. The balls were her grandest productions. The 883 costume ball had been her debut, but she continued to raise the stakes. In 1894, she hosted a ball where guests were required to dress as characters from French history, and the authenticity of costumes was judged by experts. Women spent months and thousands of dollars preparing. Men commissioned armor from European blacksmiths. The night itself was covered by every major newspaper, the details analyzed like a military campaign. Behind the spectacle, the children suffocated. Consuelo stood in receiving lines for hours, her smile frozen, her thoughts 1,000 miles away. She made polite conversation with strangers who spoke of her as if she were already a duchess, already gone, already theirs. She attended teas and dinners and dances and felt nothing except the weight of her mother's expectations pressing down like a hand on her throat. At night, alone in her bedroom, she could hear the ocean through the open windows. The sound was supposed to be soothing, but it only reminded her of the distance between where she was and where she wanted to be. She thought about Winthrop, about the letters she was not allowed to write, about the life she was not allowed to choose. She thought about her mother, about the woman who had fought so hard to build this empire and who now defended it with such ferocity that her own daughter had become the enemy. The irony was that the family looked untouchable. The newspapers praised their taste. The public envied their wealth. The social ladder that Alva had climbed now seemed unshakable, and her children looked perfectly placed at the top. But position is not the same as peace, and from this height, the only direction is down. She locked the door on freedom. When her daughter hesitated, the mother did not argue. She removed daylight, letters, and choice until surrender looked like peace. The final months before Consuelo's wedding were not a negotiation. They were a siege. Alva knew that her daughter's resistance was not a passing rebellion, but a genuine attempt to reclaim her life. So she responded with the only strategy she trusted: total control. The confinement began subtly. Consuelo found that her afternoon walks were suddenly canceled due to her mother's health concerns. Then her visiting hours were restricted because Alva needed rest. Then the door to her bedroom began to lock from the outside at night. Son of precaution, Alva explained, as necessary for the household's security. Within weeks, Consuelo was effectively imprisoned in her own home. The isolation was methodical. Letters arrived, but they were opened and read before reaching Consuelo's hands. Most were never delivered at all. She asked to see friends and was told they were traveling, indisposed, or no longer suitable company. She asked about Winthrop and was met with silence, or worse, with Alva's theatrical collapses. Her mother would clutch her heart, summon the doctor, and take to her bed, leaving Consuelo to sit alone with the terrible knowledge that her desires were literally killing the person who had given her life. Emotional blackmail is effective because it transforms rebellion into murder. Every time Consuelo considered defying her mother, she was forced to imagine the consequences. Alva collapsing, the doctor arriving too late, the funeral where everyone would whisper that the daughter's selfishness had stopped her mother's heart. It did not matter that the heart condition was likely exaggerated or entirely fabricated. The performance was convincing enough to weaponize Consuelo's love against her. The Duke visited once during this period, escorted by his family and a phalanx of attorneys. The meeting was formal, cold, and brief. Consuelo and the Duke spoke for perhaps 20 minutes, chaperoned by Alva and the Duke's cousin. They discussed nothing of substance. The Duke was polite but distant, a young man who had been raised to view marriage as a contract rather than a romance. He needed money. She came with money. The rest was decoration. After he left, Consuelo broke down. She begged her mother to cancel the engagement, to let her write to Winthrop, to allow her any choice in a future that felt like a tomb. Alva listened with the patience of a general who has already won the war. Then she explained, with perfect clarity, the mathematics of disobedience. If Consuelo refused to marry the Duke, Alva would ensure that no respectable man would ever consider her. The scandal would destroy not only Consuelo's reputation, but her siblings' prospects as well. Her younger brothers would be tainted by association. Her sister would find doors closed that had once been open. The family name, which Alva had spent decades building, would be permanently damaged. And the cause of it all would be Consuelo's selfishness, her inability to see beyond her own childish infatuation. It was a master class in coercion. Alva framed every option as a choice between love and destruction, between personal happiness and familial survival. She made it clear that Consuelo's feelings were not invalid. They were simply less important than the family's future. And she delivered this message with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided the outcome and was merely waiting for her daughter to arrive at the same conclusion. The wedding date approached. The dress was fitted. The guests were invited. Consuelo stopped crying because tears required energy she no longer had. She entered a state of numb compliance, a psychological shutdown that made each day bearable by making it meaningless. She attended the final fittings and rehearsals like an actress playing a role she had not auditioned for. On the morning of November 6th, 1895, Consuelo's maid found her staring out the window, still in her nightgown, 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The maid asked if she was ready. Consuelo turned and said, in a voice so flat it frightened the older woman, that she would never be ready, but she would be obedient because obedience was the only option her mother had left her. The ceremony at St. Thomas Church was attended by 2,000 guests. The press called it the wedding of the decade. Consuelo wore a white satin gown with a 15-foot train and a veil that had belonged to her grandmother. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, though William Vanderbilt looked almost as miserable as his daughter. He had opposed the match but had been overruled by Alva, who had divorced him the previous year and retained enough financial and social power to control their children's futures. Consuelo spoke her vows in a whisper. The Duke placed the ring on her finger with the mechanical precision of someone completing a transaction. The crowd applauded. The newspapers gushed. Alva smiled with the satisfaction of a general who has just conquered a particularly stubborn territory. What does obedience cost when the price is paid inside the mind, not the bank? Consuelo would spend the next decades discovering the answer, but on that November afternoon, she already knew that some victories destroy the victor, and some prisons have no visible bars. A son was exiled for love. He broke one rule, not money, not crime, just love, and his mother answered with Exile, written in perfect handwriting. While Alva Vanderbilt waged her war over a daughter's marriage, another battlefield was opening in a different dynasty. This one centered not on a daughter forced into marriage, but on a son punished for choosing the wrong love. The mechanics were similar, but the weapons were sharper because sons were supposed to carry the family name forward, and a son who chose badly was not just a disappointment. He was a traitor. The Astor family had been American aristocracy since the 1800s, when John Jacob Astor built a fur trading empire and converted it into Manhattan real estate. By the 1890s, the Astors were among the wealthiest families in the nation, and Caroline Astor was the undisputed queen of New York society. She decided who was in and who was out. She hosted the annual ball that defined the social season. Her approval could make a family, and her disapproval could unmake one. Her son, John Jacob Astor IV, was the heir to this empire. He was intelligent, inventive, and independently wealthy even by Astor standards. He had written a science fiction novel. He had patented mechanical devices. He had served in the Spanish-American War with distinction. But in 1909, at age 47, he committed an unforgivable sin. He fell in love with a woman his mother considered unsuitable. Madeline Force was 18 years old, beautiful, and from a respectable but not prominent Brooklyn family. She was not titled. She was not exceptionally wealthy. She was simply a young woman who caught the attention of a man old enough to be her father. In most contexts, this would have been scandalous, but manageable. The problem was that John Jacob was still married. His first marriage, to Ava Willing, had been a society triumph in 1891. But by 1909, it was a disaster. The couple had separated. Ava had taken their 2 children and retreated to England. The marriage was effectively over, but divorce was still a social death sentence, particularly for a family as prominent as the Astors. When John Jacob filed for divorce in 1909, his mother responded with the full force of her social arsenal. She did not scream or weep. Caroline Astor did not need to. She simply withdrew her support, and in doing so, she signaled to all of New York society that her son was no longer under her protection. The mechanism was elegant and brutal. Caroline stopped inviting John Jacob to family events. She stopped mentioning him in conversations. She made it clear, through carefully worded comments to friends and allies, that anyone who sided with her son would lose access to her. Given that Caroline Astor's approval was the currency of New York society, this was not a threat. It was a fact. The newspapers gleefully reported every detail. John Jacob's divorce was finalized in 1909. He married Madeleine in 1911 in a quiet ceremony that was boycotted by most of their social circle. Caroline Astor was not present. She sent no gift. She issued no statement. Her silence was louder than any condemnation. The social execution was immediate. Invitations that John Jacob had once received by the dozen stopped arriving. Their friends who had been close for decades suddenly discovered they were too busy to accept his calls. Business partners began to distance themselves, worried that association with a scandal would damage their own reputations. John Jacob and Madeleine were not shunned in the dramatic sense. They were simply erased, as if they had never existed. The cruelty of maternal gatekeeping is that it operates through absence. Caroline Astor did not need to actively destroy her son's life. She simply removed herself from it and let society do the rest. In a world where social capital was as important as financial capital, losing your mother's approval meant losing access to the systems that made wealth functional. John Jacob responded by fleeing. He and Madeline left for an extended European honeymoon, partly to escape the scandal and partly because there was nothing left for them in New York. They traveled through Egypt, France, and England, staying in the best hotels and pretending that exile was adventure. But exile has a way of revealing what was always true. John Jacob discovered that his wealth could buy comfort, but not belonging. He could afford any experience, but he could not afford to go home. Madeline, still a teenager, found herself married to a man whose family had rejected him and whose mother had made him a social pariah. She had won the battle for his love, but the prize was isolation. Carolyn Astor never publicly acknowledged her son's marriage. She continued to reign over New York society as if John Jacob had ceased to exist. When asked about him, she changed the subject with the smooth grace of someone who had spent a lifetime controlling conversations. She had lost a son, but she had kept her principles, and to Caroline, that was a victory. The question that haunted John Jacob was simple. If a mother controls the family's social oxygen, how does a child breathe without her? He spent the rest of his short life trying to answer it, building a new life in the spaces his mother could not reach, and wondering if freedom was worth the price of loneliness. But the story was not over. In April 1912, John Jacob and Madeleine boarded a ship called the Titanic, heading back to New York to face whatever remained of their old life. What happened next would ensure that John Jacob Astor became more famous in death than his mother had ever been in life, and that the family's social calculations would be rendered meaningless by a disaster no amount of money could prevent. The will became a loaded gun. In the end, it was not a scream that changed everything. It was a document that turned affection into a legal weapon. By the early 1900s, the American legal system had evolved to accommodate the peculiar needs of the wealthy. Trusts, settlements, and inheritance structures allowed families to control fortunes across generations, dictating not only who received money, but how they were allowed to use it. These documents were drafted by attorneys who understood that wealth was power, and power required maintenance. The will was no longer just a distribution of assets. It was an enforcement mechanism, a way to discipline the living from beyond the grave. Alva Vanderbilt understood this instinctively. After her divorce from William Vanderbilt in 1895, she had negotiated a settlement that gave her complete financial independence and control over her children's social futures. The settlement was worth roughly $10 million, an enormous sum that ensured she would never need to compromise or beg. But money without leverage is just paper. Alva needed a way to ensure that her children remained obedient, even as they aged and theoretically gained independence. The answer was the trust fund. Rather than giving Consuelo direct access to her inheritance, Alva structured it so that the money flowed through trustees who could adjust distributions based on behavior. If Consuelo divorced the Duke without her mother's approval, the income could be reduced or eliminated entirely. If she created a scandal, the same. The trust was not a gift. It was a leash, and Alva held the other end. This was not unique to the Vanderbilts. Across American high society, wills and trusts were being weaponized to control behavior long after the original patriarch or matriarch had died. Children who married against their parents' wishes found themselves cut off, not immediately, but gradually, as distributions were delayed, reduced, or made contingent on impossible conditions. The attorneys who drafted these documents were masters of legal ambiguity, creating provisions that sounded reasonable but functioned as punishments. Consider the scale of these fortunes and the complexity of their controls. The Vanderbilt Empire at its peak was worth roughly $200 million in 1890, equivalent to about $6 billion today. The Astor fortune was similarly massive, estimated at $150 million in 1900, or roughly $4.5 billion in modern terms. These were not simple inheritances. They were dynasties, and dynasties required governance. The legal fees alone were staggering. A single contested will could employ a dozen attorneys and last for years. The Vanderbilt family would eventually spend millions litigating various estate disputes, with siblings suing siblings and children challenging their parents' decisions from beyond the grave. The Astor estate was similarly contentious, with different branches of the family fighting over properties, businesses, and the right to use the family name. But the most insidious aspect of these legal structures was not the fighting. It was the compliance they enforced. Children learned early that their access to money was contingent on their behavior, and that behavior was defined by their parents, not by law or logic. A daughter who refused to attend family events could find her allowance reduced. A son who married without approval could lose his position in the family business. The threats were never explicit. They were simply understood, woven into the fabric of daily life. Consuelo Vanderbilt lived under this system for years. Her marriage to the Duke of Marlborough was a financial arrangement held in place by legal documents she had no power to change. Her annual income from the trust was $100,000, but she could not access the principal. She could not sell the stock. She could not redirect the money without her mother's approval. The Duke, meanwhile, received his own distributions, ensuring that he remained invested in the marriage, even if affection died. The Duke's financial situation was equally constrained. Blenheim Palace required roughly $50,000 per year just for basic maintenance, equivalent to $1.5 million today. The estate employed 200 staff members. The gardens alone covered 2,000 acres. The Duke was trapped by his inheritance just as surely as Consuelo was trapped by hers. He could not sell the palace without destroying his family name. He could not abandon it without losing his identity. So, he stayed, managed the money, and treated his marriage as the job it had always been. This is where the aristocratic system revealed its deepest cruelty. Everyone was imprisoned by the same structures, but they blamed each other instead of the cage. The Duke resented Consuelo for being American, gauche, and unwilling to perform happiness. Consuelo resented the Duke for accepting her money and giving nothing in return. Alva resented them both for failing to produce the fairy tale she had purchased. And beneath all of this resentment was the simple fact that none of them were free. The turning point came not through rebellion, but through exhaustion. By 1906, Consuelo had given birth to 2 sons, fulfilling her primary duty as a duchess. She had spent a decade managing Blenheim Palace, hosting events, and playing the role her mother had written for her. And she had discovered that performance cannot sustain a life. The marriage was hollow, the title was meaningless. The wealth that was supposed to make everything beautiful had only made the emptiness more visible. She began to quietly explore the possibility of separation, hiring her own attorneys and discovering that the legal structures binding her were even more complex than she had imagined. The trust could not be broken. The marriage could only be ended through lengthy legal proceedings that would require her mother's cooperation. Even her children were not fully hers, legally speaking. The Duke had rights that superseded her own. The lesson was clear. When affection is transactional and family is enforced through contracts, the only escape is to become a better attorney than the people controlling you. Consuelo would eventually succeed, but it would take another decade of patience, strategy, and the slow accumulation of allies who were willing to help her dismantle the cage her mother had built. For now, at the end of Act 2, the rebellion was no longer private. The family's public myth was beginning to crack. And the question was not whether Consuelo would eventually escape, but whether there would be anything left of her by the time she did. Her daughter became a haunted trophy. The title arrived, the portraits were painted, and yet the bride looked like someone watching her life happen from a distance. Blenheim Palace was magnificent and unforgiving. Built in the early 1700s, the estate sprawled across 2,000 acres of Oxfordshire countryside, with formal gardens, artificial lakes, and a house so large that it required a map to navigate. The staterooms were decorated with priceless tapestries, old master paintings, and furniture that predated the American Revolution. It was a monument to British power and aristocratic continuity, and Consuelo Vanderbilt was expected to maintain it, inhabit it, and love it. She did none of those things convincingly. The early years of her marriage, from 1895 to 1900, were characterized by a profound disconnection. Consuelo performed her duties flawlessly. She hosted dinners for visiting royalty. She attended county events and charity functions. She supervised the staff, managed the household accounts, and ensured that the palace ran with aristocratic precision. But inside, she was numb, moving through her days with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has learned that resistance is pointless and emotion is a liability. The Duke was not cruel in any overt sense. Yeah, he was simply absent. He had married for money, secured it, and now focused on his real interests, politics, land management, and the preservation of his family legacy. He was polite to Consuelo in public and indifferent in private. They inhabited the same house but lived separate lives, meeting primarily for formal occasions and avoiding any conversation that required vulnerability or honesty. The birth of her sons, John in 1897 and Ivor in 1898, provided a brief respite from the emptiness. Consuelo poured her stifled affection into the children, determined that they would not inherit the coldness she had experienced. She played with them, read to them, and protected them from the formality that suffocated adult life in the palace. But even motherhood was constrained. The boys had nurses, tutors, and a rigid schedule that left little room for spontaneity. And as they grew older, they would be sent away to boarding school, following the British tradition that viewed parental attachment as a weakness to be overcome. The press continued to cover Consuelo's life with breathless enthusiasm. American newspapers ran regular updates on the Duchess of Marlborough, describing her jewels, her wardrobe, and her appearances at court. They transformed her isolation into glamour, her duty into romance, and her imprisonment into a fairy tale. The public saw the portraits and the headlines and concluded that she had everything. They did not see the locked door, the silence, or the growing certainty that she had traded her personhood for a title. There were moments when the facade cracked. At a dinner party in 1902, a guest observed Consuelo staring out the window during a lull in conversation, her expression so distant that it seemed she had forgotten where she was. When asked if she was well, she startled, smiled, and offered a perfectly appropriate response. But the guest later remarked that it was like watching someone wake from a nightmare and realize the nightmare was still happening. Rumors began to circulate about the state of the marriage. Some were accurate. The Duke and Duchess rarely spoke in private. Others were exaggerated, that they had separate wings of the palace and communicated only through servants. A few were pure invention, that Consuelo was haunted by the ghost of a previous duchess, that she wandered the halls at night, and that the marriage was cursed by the jewels Alva had given her as a wedding present. The curse story, in particular, gained traction. The pearl and diamond necklace Alva had commissioned for Consuelo's wedding was said to bring misfortune to any woman who wore it. This was nonsense, of course, the product of reporters looking for drama and a public hungry for Gothic details. But like many rumors, it contained a kernel of truth. The necklace was not cursed. It was a symbol. It represented everything Consuelo had been forced to accept: beauty without joy, value without love, and the permanent reminder that she was a transaction, not a person. Consuelo did experience insomnia and what would now be recognized as depression. She struggled to sleep in the vast, cold bedrooms of Blenheim. She lost weight, complained of headaches, and spent long hours alone in the palace library, reading novels about women who escaped their circumstances through adventure or death. The Duke noticed but did not intervene, interpreting her unhappiness as a temperamental flaw rather than a response to an intolerable situation. What happens when the prize is the cage? Consuelo was living the answer. She had a title, a palace, and a fortune. She appeared in court photographs standing beside the King and Queen of England. She wore gowns worth thousands of dollars and jewels that museums would later covet. But none of it was hers in any meaningful sense. It was loaned to her, contingent on her continued obedience to a system that valued her for what she represented rather than who she was. By 1906, after more than a decade of marriage, Consuelo had begun to quietly research the possibility of divorce. The British law made it difficult, requiring proof of adultery or cruelty, neither of which applied to her situation. The Duke was not violent or unfaithful. He was simply indifferent, and indifference was not grounds for legal separation. American law was slightly more flexible, but divorcing would mean admitting that the fairy tale had been a lie, and that admission would humiliate not only Consuelo, but her mother, who had staked her reputation on the match. Alva, meanwhile, had moved on to other conquests. She had remarried in 1896 to Oliver Belmont, another wealthy socialite, and had thrown herself into the women's suffrage movement. She hosted rallies, donated money, and positioned herself as a champion of female independence, and apparently oblivious to the irony that she had denied her own daughter any independence whatsoever. When Consuelo wrote to her mother expressing her unhappiness, Alva's responses were dismissive. She suggested that Consuelo was being dramatic, that she should focus on her duties, and that every marriage required sacrifice. The letters between them became weapons. Consuelo would describe her isolation, and Alva would respond with accounts of her own busy, fulfilling life. Consuelo would ask for support, and Alva would offer advice that essentially boiled down to endure. The message was clear: you made your bed, now lie in it. That the bed had been made for her, not by her, was a detail Alva chose to ignore. What was happening to Consuelo was not supernatural, but it was eerie in its predictability. She was becoming a ghost in her own life, impresent but not visible, speaking but not heard, performing a role that required nothing from her except compliance. The portraits captured her beauty, but not her despair. The newspapers reported her appearances, but not her absences. and the people who saw her in public concluded that she was living a dream, when in fact she was trapped in someone else's nightmare. The cost of coercion is not always paid immediately. Sometimes it accumulates slowly, year by year, until the person you were is so distant that you cannot remember what it felt like to want something, to choose something, to be someone. Consuelo was not yet free, but she was beginning to understand that freedom was possible, and that understanding was both a hope and a torment. The house turned into a courtroom. When the family stopped speaking, our strangers started billing by the hour, and the mother's war moved into public records. The transition from private suffering to public spectacle often happens suddenly, triggered by a single event that forces the family's secrets into the light. But sometimes it happens slowly, as resentment builds and legal structures that were designed to protect the dynasty begin to tear it apart from within. By the early 1910s, multiple American dynasties were discovering that the mechanisms of control had become engines of destruction. The Astor family was the first to fully weaponize litigation. After Caroline Astor's death in 1908, the estate was divided among her descendants, but the divisions were unequal and contested. The will favored certain children over others, rewarded obedience and punished deviation. John Jacob Astor IV, already estranged from his family due to his scandalous marriage to Madeline Force, found himself fighting not only for his inheritance, but for his right to be acknowledged as an Astor at all. The legal battle required an army of attorneys. The Astor estate employed at least 12 law firms simultaneously, each specializing in different aspects of estate law, property rights, or family litigation. The hearings dragged on for years, with depositions, cross-examinations, and testimony that revealed the family's private resentments to a public that devoured every detail. The newspapers covered the proceedings with the enthusiasm usually reserved for murder trials, printing verbatim excerpts from courtroom exchanges that exposed just how much the Astors hated each other. The financial scale of these battles was staggering. Legal fees alone consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars, roughly 10 to 15 million in today's terms. But the emotional cost was higher. Family members were forced to testify against each other, to publicly quantify their grievances, and to watch as their private pain was transformed into entertainment for strangers. The trial transcripts ran to thousands of pages, documenting every slight, every betrayal, and every moment when love had been traded for strategy. Consuelo Vanderbilt's path to litigation was slower, but no less inevitable. By 1912, her marriage to the Duke of Marlborough was unsustainable. They had tried counseling, such as it existed in that era, and failed. They had tried simply avoiding each other, which worked until it became clear that avoidance was just a prelude to separation. Consuelo wanted a divorce. The Duke was willing, provided the financial arrangements remained intact. The problem was Alva. Alva had spent 17 years defending the marriage as a triumph. To admit that it had failed would be to admit that her entire strategy, her life's work of social engineering, had been built on a foundation of coercion rather than wisdom. So when Consuelo approached her for support, Alva refused. She argued that divorce would destroy Consuelo's reputation, harm her sons, and unravel the Vanderbilt family's standing in both American and British society. She was not entirely wrong, but she was entirely self-interested. Consuelo hired her own attorneys, a team of specialists who understood both American and British divorce law. The process was complicated by the fact that the marriage had been contracted under British law, but funded by American money, and the children were dual citizens with inheritance claims in both countries. Every question required multiple lawyers, and every answer generated new questions. The negotiations took months, then years, as each side maneuvered for advantage. The press coverage was relentless. Every filing, every hearing, every rumor was reported in newspapers across 2 continents. Readers followed the case like a serial novel, debating whether Consuelo was a victim or a spoiled heiress abandoning her duties. The Duke was alternately portrayed as a cold aristocrat who had married for money and a dignified nobleman wronged by American vulgarity. Alva, fascinatingly, managed to position herself as a champion of women's independence while simultaneously opposing her daughter's attempt to exercise that very independence. The case dragged through 1913 and into 1914. At its peak, the combined legal teams numbered over 30 attorneys, each billing hundreds of dollars per day, roughly $15,000 in modern terms. The depositions alone required 12 weeks of testimony. Witnesses included servants, friends, family members, and financial experts who quantified every aspect of the marriage, from the Duke's income to Consuelo's emotional state. The records document conversations that were never meant to be public, letters that were never meant to be evidence, and grievances that were never meant to be quantified. One particularly revealing exchange occurred when Alva was asked why she had opposed Consuelo's initial refusal to marry the Duke. Her answer, preserved in the court transcript, was chilling in its honesty. She said that she had believed, and still believed, that personal happiness was less important than family duty. She argued that Consuelo's generation did not understand sacrifice, that they expected love and fulfillment without recognizing that those were luxuries their position did not afford. She concluded by stating that she had done what any mother would do, ensured her daughter's future, even if her daughter could not yet appreciate it. The transcript does not record Consuelo's reaction, but witnesses later described her expression as one of profound, quiet devastation. This was the moment when the illusion finally shattered completely. Her mother had not been mistaken or misguided. She had been intentional. She had chosen the dynasty over the daughter, and she would do it again. The question that haunted the courtroom was simple. If the family's love is conditional, who is left when conditions change? The answer, written into every page of testimony, was that lawyers are left, accountants are left, judges are left. But the people who once called each other family are gone, replaced by adversaries who happen to share a last name. The case was eventually settled out of court in 1921, after the Duke and Consuelo had already been separated for years. The financial terms were never fully disclosed, but it was understood that Consuelo retained her Vanderbilt money and the Duke kept Blenheim Palace. The marriage was annulled by the Catholic Church, allowing both parties to remarry. The press declared it a victory for modern sensibility over outdated tradition. But for the people involved, it was simply the end of a war that should never have been fought. What litigation reveals is not justice, but the cost of avoiding intimacy. When families cannot speak to each other, they hire intermediaries. When they cannot negotiate, they litigate. And when the dust settles, the only certainty is that everyone has lost something irreplaceable, even if the balance sheets claim otherwise. The night the dynasty could not control. One scandal, one disappearance, one headline, and suddenly, the mother's control looked like desperation, not strength. The Titanic sank on April 15, 1912, taking 1,500 lives with it. Among the dead was John Jacob Astor IV, the man who had been exiled by his mother for marrying the wrong woman. He had helped his 18-year-old wife Madeleine into a lifeboat, declined a seat for himself, and gone down with the ship. His body was recovered days later, identified by the initials on his jacket and the fortune in his pockets. The story dominated newspapers for weeks. John Jacob was a hero, a gentleman who had given his life so that women and children could survive. The scandal that had made him a pariah 2 years earlier was suddenly irrelevant. In death, he was redeemed, and the family that had rejected him scrambled to reclaim him. But the redemption came with complications. Madeleine was pregnant when the ship sank, and she gave birth to a son, John Jacob Astor VI, in August 1912. The child was the heir to an enormous fortune, estimated at $87 million, roughly $2.5 billion in today's terms. But Madeleine's position was precarious. Caroline Astor had died before the Titanic disaster, but the rest of the family made it clear that they did not consider Madeleine a legitimate member. She was tolerated because she was the mother of an heir, but she was not welcomed. The will became a battlefield. John Jacob had left provisions for Madeleine, but they were contingent on her remaining unmarried. If she remarried, she would lose her access to the trust, and her son's inheritance would be managed by family-appointed trustees rather than his mother. It was a classic Gilded Age control mechanism, providing security while ensuring obedience. Madeleine was trapped between financial independence and personal freedom, and the family knew it. She chose freedom. In 1919, she remarried, forfeiting her financial claim and retreating from the Astor dynasty entirely. Her son remained connected to the family, but was raised primarily by trustees and boarding schools, inheriting wealth but not warmth. The pattern repeated: money without love, inheritance without intimacy, and control extending even beyond death. The Astor family's public image never fully recovered. The Titanic disaster had exposed their calculations to scrutiny they could not manage. The press, which had once treated them as royalty, now questioned their values. How could a family exile a son for marrying for love, and then claim him as a hero once he was safely dead? The hypocrisy was too obvious to ignore, and the dynasty that had seemed unshakable suddenly looked fragile, held together not by bonds, but by attorneys. Meanwhile, across multiple families, the breaking points were converging. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, and dozens of other dynasties were discovering that control has limits. Children who had been trained to obey were beginning to rebel. Daughters who had been sold into titled marriages were seeking divorces. Sons who had been disinherited were suing. And mothers who had spent decades building their empires were watching them crack. There were whispers of something darker. Servants spoke of Blenheim Palace being haunted, of corridors where Consuelo would pace at night, unable to sleep. Guests at Newport cottages reported strange sounds, locked rooms, and an atmosphere of dread that no amount of wealth could dispel. Some claimed that the jewels worn by society matriarchs were cursed, that the pearls brought misfortune, and the diamonds drained life from their owners. These stories were, almost certainly, the product of exhausted imaginations and a public eager for Gothic drama. But they contained a truth that the numbers could not capture. These houses were haunted, not by ghosts, but by the people who lived in them. The desperation, the insomnia, the sense that the walls were closing in, these were not supernatural phenomena. They were the predictable results of lives built on repression, duty, and the constant performance of happiness. The publicity machine that had once protected these families now amplified their failures. The journalists who had written fawning profiles now penned exposés. Photographers who had captured glamorous balls now sought out the cracks in the facade. The more the families tried to control the narrative, the more they revealed that the narrative had always been a lie. By 1915, the transformation was complete. The children had stopped being pieces in their parents' games and started becoming enemies, adversaries who would fight back with the same legal and financial weapons that had been used to control them. The mothers who had engineered dynasties now faced a simple truth. You can buy obedience, but you cannot buy loyalty, and when the first generation of the coerced grows up, they remember everything. The night the dynasty could not control was not a single event, but a series of ruptures, in each one small but collectively fatal. A daughter sues for divorce, a son contests a will, a widow remarries, a scandal breaks, and suddenly the machinery that had seemed invincible is revealed to be fragile, held together by fear and money, neither of which lasts forever. She won everything, then lost everyone. The parties continued, but the rooms felt emptier because control cannot hug you back when the doors finally close. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont lived until 1933, dying at age 80 after a life spent building empires, breaking rules, and bending her children to her will. She had outlived most of her peers and many of her enemies. She had accumulated wealth, power, and a reputation as both a visionary and a tyrant. But in her final years, the victory began to look hollow. The social empire she had constructed was crumbling. The balls she had once hosted with such fanfare were smaller, attended by fewer people of consequence. The invitations she had once controlled with such precision now went unanswered or declined. The younger generation did not remember her triumphs. They remembered her cruelties, and they stayed away. Her relationship with Consuelo remained fractured. After the divorce was finalized in 1921, Consuelo remarried, this time to a man she loved, and built a life that had nothing to do with her mother's ambitions. She wrote her memoirs in 1952, decades after Alva's death, and the portrait they painted was damning. Consuelo described her mother as brilliant but cold, strategic but incapable of affection, as a woman who had sacrificed her daughter's happiness for social triumph and never expressed regret. The statistics of Alva's later years paint a picture of increasing isolation. At the height of her influence in the 1890s, she had hosted events with 300 guests. By the 1920s, her gatherings rarely exceeded 30. Her inner circle, once dozens strong, had shrunk to a handful of paid companions and attorneys. She still commanded respect, but it was the respect accorded to a retired general, someone whose battles are history rather than present danger. The houses she had filled with guests became museums of her ambition. Marble House in Newport, the $11 million palace she had commissioned, was used less and less as she aged. The staff was reduced from 40 to fewer than 10. The ballroom that had once hosted hundreds stood empty, a monument to parties that no one remembered and triumphs that no longer mattered. She eventually donated it to a women's suffrage organization, framing the gift as progressive philanthropy while quietly admitting that she no longer had the energy or the guest list to justify keeping it. Her financial resources remained vast, but wealth without relationships is just numbers. She could afford anything except the one thing she had never learned to value: intimacy. She had trained her children to be symbols, not people. And now that they were grown, they treated her with the same transactional courtesy she had taught them. They visited on holidays, they sent gifts, they fulfilled obligations. But they did not love her because she had never shown them how. Alva spent her final years involved in the suffrage movement, fighting for women's rights with the same intensity she had once applied to social conquest. The irony was not lost on observers. Here was a woman who had denied her own daughter the right to choose her husband, now arguing that all women deserved autonomy. When confronted with this contradiction, Alva reportedly said that she had done what was necessary in a world that did not yet value women's choices. She framed her coercion as a product of her era, not her character, and refused to apologize. The question haunted her in ways she never acknowledged publicly. What is power worth when it buys silence, not love? Alva had won every battle she set out to win. She had forced New York society to accept her. She had married her daughter to a duke. She had accumulated wealth, had built palaces, and left a mark that would last for generations. But when she died, the people at her funeral were there out of obligation, not grief. The rooms she left behind were full of furniture, but empty of warmth. Her legacy, documented in archives and estate records, reveals the full scope of her empire and its decline. At her peak, she controlled properties worth tens of millions, employed hundreds of staff across multiple estates, and influenced the social lives of thousands. By her death, the properties were being sold, the staff dismissed, and her influence reduced to historical footnote. The transformation took decades, but it was total. She had built a dynasty on control, and control is not inheritable. Consuelo, in her memoir, reflected on what it meant to be raised by a woman who loved power more than people. She wrote that her mother had been a force of nature, brilliant and terrible, capable of moving mountains, but incapable of holding a hand. She described the childhood she had endured, the marriage she had survived, and the decades it took to recover her sense of self. And she concluded with a simple observation. Her mother had won everything and lost everyone, and in the end, the victories were not worth the cost. What remains of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont is architecture and anecdote. The houses still stand. The newspaper archives document her triumphs. The legal records preserve her strategies. But the person she was, the interior life she lived, remains largely unknown because she never allowed vulnerability, and vulnerability is the only thing that makes us real. The children paid the hidden bill. Years later, the inheritance still worked, but their minds did not, and the cost surfaced in patterns no money could erase. The long-tail consequences of coercive parenting are difficult to quantify because they are not recorded in estate documents or newspaper archives. They live in private letters, medical records, and the quiet desperation that families pretend is normal. But the patterns are consistent across dynasties. Children raised as investments develop predictable pathologies. They inherit wealth, but not resilience. They learn etiquette, but not empathy. And they pass the trauma forward, disguising it as tradition. Consuelo Vanderbilt spent years in therapy, or the Edwardian equivalent, trying to recover from a childhood that had denied her autonomy and a marriage that had felt like imprisonment. She struggled with depression well into middle age. She described feeling disconnected from her own life, as if she were watching herself from a distance, a symptom now recognized as dissociation, but then dismissed as nervous temperament. The numbness she had developed as a survival mechanism during her marriage became a permanent feature, something she could manage but never fully escape. Her sons inherited their own burdens. They had been raised in Blenheim Palace, surrounded by wealth and formality, but starved of warmth. Their parents' marriage had been a performance, and the children had learned early that love was optional, but appearances were mandatory. Both boys were sent to boarding school young, following British tradition, and both struggled with the isolation. Letters between Consuelo and her sons reveal her desperate attempts to maintain connection despite the system's design to prevent it, and the boys' equally desperate need for affection they had been taught not to expect. The Astor descendants faced similar struggles. John Jacob Astor VI, born months after his father's death on the Titanic, grew up without parents in any meaningful sense. His mother had remarried and left the family. His trustees managed his inheritance, but not his childhood. He was raised by nannies, tutors, and eventually boarding schools, institutions that provided structure, but not love. He inherited $87 million and no emotional foundation. The money bought comfort, but not stability, and he spent much of his adult life searching for something he could not name. The pattern repeated across generations. In children of coerced marriages often replicated the same dynamics in their own relationships, choosing partners for status rather than affection, or fleeing intimacy entirely and remaining alone. Daughters who had watched their mothers weaponize love became mothers who did not know how to express it. Sons who had been controlled through money became fathers who controlled in turn. The cycle was not inevitable, but it was common because trauma is an inheritance that requires no legal documents. Addiction became a recurring theme. Not always to substances, though there were cases of that as well, but to distraction, to constant motion, to anything that prevented introspection. Society matrons filled their calendars to avoid being alone with their thoughts. Heirs traveled the world without ever arriving anywhere. The wealth that was supposed to provide security instead provided the means to avoid facing what had been lost. The social rules that had governed Gilded Age life made seeking help nearly impossible. Therapy was stigmatized. Depression was seen as weakness. Admitting that you were unhappy despite having everything was tantamount to admitting that you were ungrateful, and ingratitude was unforgivable. So people suffered quietly, performing wellness while drowning in private. The documented cases are heartbreaking in their specificity. Letters from adult children to their aging mothers, asking for acknowledgement, for apology, for any recognition that what had been done to them was wrong. The responses, when they came at all, ranged from dismissive to defensive. Mothers insisting they had done their best, that sacrifice was required, in that the children simply did not understand. The gap between what was felt and what was said remained unbridgeable. Consuelo's memoir, published in 1952, was an act of radical honesty for its time. She named what had been done to her. She described the coercion, the confinement, and the decades of emotional recovery. She refused to frame her mother's actions as love, even complicated love, and instead called them what they were: control. The book was controversial. Some praised her courage. Others accused her of ingratitude, of airing private grievances for public consumption. But for children of similar circumstances, it was a lifeline, proof that someone had survived and was willing to say the quiet part out loud. How does trauma persist when the house looks perfect? It persists in the silence, in the things that are never discussed, in the expectations that are never questioned. It persists in the belief that wealth should insulate you from pain, and the shame when it does not. It persists because the mechanisms of control are never fully dismantled. They are simply rebranded as tradition, as family values, as the way things have always been done. The children who paid the hidden bill were not just the heirs. They were the next generation, who inherited houses full of ghosts they could not see and rules they did not understand. They were the cousins who attended family gatherings out of obligation and felt nothing. They were the descendants who looked at old photographs and saw strangers wearing their names. The cost was not financial. The fortunes remained intact for decades, carefully managed by trustees and advisors. The cost was human. It was measured in relationships that never formed, affection that was never expressed, and the quiet certainty that something essential had been traded away and could never be recovered. The curse was not supernatural. The darkest secret of old money is that the fortune is real, but the tenderness often is not. The dynasties we have examined, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the dozens of families who lived by the same ruthless mathematics, all faced the same reckoning. They built empires that outlasted their builders. They accumulated wealth that survived the generations. But they failed to transmit the one thing that makes inheritance meaningful: the ability to love without conditions. The numbers tell part of the story. At the height of the Gilded Age, from 1880 to 1920, American dynasties controlled staggering fortunes. The Vanderbilt family fortune peaked at around $200 million in 1890, roughly $6 billion in modern terms. The Astors held $150 million, about $4.5 billion today. These families owned dozens of properties, employed thousands of staff, and influenced the social and political landscape of an entire era. The infrastructure of control was equally vast. A single Newport season required 6 months of planning, 40 to 50 staff members, and budgets that exceeded $100,000 for 3 months of parties, equivalent to $3 million today. The weddings cost tens of thousands. The divorces cost more. The legal battles consumed millions in fees, hundreds of hours of testimony, and decades of accumulated resentment. But the emotional costs cannot be calculated. How do you quantify a childhood spent under surveillance? How do you measure the damage of being told that your feelings matter less than your name? How do you account for the years spent recovering from a marriage you never chose? The legacy these families left is complicated. They built museums, funded universities, and donated art that the public can still enjoy. The houses they constructed are now landmarks, beautiful and haunting. The social structures they created influenced American culture for generations, for better and worse. But they also left a trail of broken people, children who inherited fortunes but not happiness, and grandchildren who inherited neither. The curse that seemed to follow these families was not supernatural. It was the predictable result of prioritizing dynasty over humanity. When mothers raise children as investments, the children learn that love is transactional. When marriage is a contract negotiated by attorneys, intimacy becomes impossible. When inheritance is conditional on obedience, freedom becomes the only thing worth inheriting. Consuelo Vanderbilt lived until 1964. Dying at age 87 after a long and ultimately fulfilling second life. She remarried a man she loved, Jacques Balsan, a French aviator who treated her as a person rather than a duchess. She wrote her memoir, traveled the world, and built relationships based on affection rather than obligation. But she never fully recovered from what her mother had done, and she spent her final decades trying to ensure that her own children and grandchildren would not inherit the same patterns. Her sons, both of whom she loved fiercely, despite the constraints of her first marriage, lived complicated lives marked by the same struggles with intimacy and purpose that plagued their generation. They had wealth, titles, and access, but they were shaped by a system that valued appearance over authenticity, and they never fully escaped it. The Astor descendants scattered across continents, some maintaining their connection to the family name, and others abandoning it entirely. The fortune was divided and subdivided, managed by trusts that ensured no single heir would be burdened with too much responsibility or too much freedom. The name remained famous, but the people carrying it became increasingly anonymous, untethered from both the wealth and the values that had defined their ancestors. The final scale paragraph contains this verdict. From 1880 to 1920, American dynasties built an empire on roughly $500 million of combined wealth, roughly $15 billion in modern terms. They employed tens of thousands of staff across hundreds of properties. They hosted thousands of events attended by hundreds of thousands of guests. They arranged dozens of titled marriages, fought hundreds of legal battles, and spent millions on lawyers, architects, and publicity. They lasted on average 3 to 4 generations before the fortunes were dissipated, the houses sold, and the descendants scattered. The median duration of American aristocracy was 60 to 80 years, a single human lifespan. I'm proving that no amount of money can purchase permanence. What remains are the questions. If mothers could buy dynasties but not peace, what does that reveal about ambition? If beauty and wealth could not protect children from suffering, what good were they? If the families that seemed most powerful were also most trapped, what does power actually mean? The answer, written in the lives of 3 generations, is that power without love is fragile. Control without affection is unsustainable, and dynasties built on coercion will always collapse, not because of external threats, but because they hollow themselves out from within. The curse was not the jewels or the houses or the money. The curse was the belief that any of those things could substitute for tenderness. The darkest secret of old money is not that it corrupts, it is that it reveals. It shows us who we are when all the constraints are removed, except the ones we impose on ourselves. And for the matriarchs of the Gilded Age, the constraint they chose was control. Control over their children, their reputations, and their legacies. They won the battles they set out to win. They lost the war that mattered, and the children, who were supposed to carry the dynasty forward, instead carried the scars, invisible but permanent, a legacy far more durable than any fortune.ch.